This talk is about the way in which modern evolutionary biology can be twisted into old anti-Semitic tropes about biological, racial, Jewish traits. I will focus on the work of Kevin MacDonald, who's had the most influence. First, consider three major anti-Semites in recent years. David Irving. MacDonald was the only academic to voluntarily testify in the Holocaust denier suit against Deborah Lipstadt. Then we have David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and an organizer of the Unite the Right rally, the Jews Will Not Replace Us rally in Charlottesville. And then we have Richard Spencer, the neo-Nazi co-organizer of the Unite the Right rally. Let's take a closer look at how MacDonald has fostered pseudoscientific anti-Semitism that appears, even to some Jewish academics, to be legitimate and valid science. First, consider Richard Spencer's homage as he introduces MacDonald to us.
There is no man on the planet who has done more for the understanding of the pole around which the world revolves than Kevin MacDonald. Welcome. They know who you are.
No, they know, okay. All right, it's great to be here after such an exciting, inspiring victory for Donald Trump. I mean, I don't think anybody really expected it. He could be a hero of our people. And I think that's what we all hope, and it could happen. I really do think it's going to happen. But tonight I'm going to talk about Jews. It's not that I relish doing this, but somebody's got to do it. And it's definitely a subject that should be addressed. The prominent author and Zionist pioneer Israel Zangwill, who articulated the idea that America is an ideal place to achieve Jewish interests. Jews were correct that America did indeed hold great promise as a place where Jews could thrive. And part of that was about who we are, the goyim, us. There's a very long liberal tradition in America, going back, most importantly, to the Puritan strand of American culture that dominated America really until the 1960s and the rise of Jewish power. This tradition prized individualism, which I think has an ethnic basis. Individualists are relatively less ethnocentric. They tend towards assimilating other groups rather than erecting strong barriers between groups.
As an evolutionist, supposedly looking dispassionately at differences between human breeding groups, ethnic basis is MacDonald's term for evolved biological differences between groups. Gentiles, like himself he claims, evolved to be more individualistic, while Jews are biologically more ethnocentric. Jews erect barriers between themselves and others, while in contrast, Gentiles tend to welcome others to join them. Now he supports these claims with diligent scholarship, in which he presents valid evidence of Jewish ethnocentrism. The problem, of course, is that he makes the rather bizarre claim that in contrast with Jews, Gentile Europeans have always been biologically more predisposed to be accepting and open to others. Not only are Jews different, but they engaged in a, quote, eugenic Jewish evolutionary strategy in which they bred themselves into a superior predatory race so that they could take advantage of the more loving and gentle Gentiles. How can MacDonald make such absurd claims and convince others that they are scientific? The formula works like this. Step 1. Identify a trait that is common for all human groups. Step 2. Use diligent scholarship to document that the trait can, in fact, be found in Jewish groups. Step 3. Make up a just-so story explaining how the Jews got the trait. Evolutionists have likened fanciful, pseudoscientific, and often racist evolutionary explanations to Rudyard Kipling's just-so stories for little children, which were fanciful bedtime stories he made up for his daughter. For example, How the Leopard Got His Spots. Like MacDonald's Jewish evolutionary strategy, in this just-so story, a leopard and his Ethiopian hunting partner engage in a pantherific evolutionary strategy in which they decorate the leopard with spots so that, like the sneaky Jews with unsuspecting Gentiles, the leopard can use his camouflage to sneak up on unsuspecting prey.
I'd hate to go hunting without you, but I must if you insist on looking like a sunflower against a tarred fence.
I'll take spots then, said the leopard,
I'll make 'em with the tips of my fingers.
said the Ethiopian. Then the Ethiopian put his 5 fingers close together and pressed them all over the leopard. And wherever the 5 fingers touched, they left 5 little black marks all close together.
So, once you have a good just-so story, step 4, claim, based solely upon that invented tale, that Jews have the universal evolved biological trait more than members of other groups. Consider this just-so story that attempts to explain why Jews, of all things, once dominated the sport of basketball. The predominance of Jewish players became the subject of learned scientific treatises. Writers opined that Jews were genetically and culturally built to stand up under the strain and stamina of the hoop game. It was suggested that they had an advantage because short men have better balance and more foot speed, and it was said that they were clever. The reason I suspect that basketball appeals to the Hebrew with his Oriental background, wrote Paul Gallico, sports editor of the New York Daily News and one of the premier sports writers of the 1930s, is that the game places a premium on an alert, scheming mind, flashy trickiness, artful dodging, and general smart aleckness. Note that no comparative data is necessary. For example, did you know that unlike Gentile groups, Jewish groups tend to be controlled by their most committed members?
As throughout Jewish history, the most committed members have determined which way the entire community is going to go. This is doubtless true of most groups, but it's especially true with Jews, where there's a very long history of fanaticism, even suicidal fanaticism, going back to the Middle Ages and the ancient world.
Despite acknowledging that this trait can be found in all groups solely based on the logic of his just-so story about how the Jews got the trait, he makes a claim that Jews have it more. Yet the tendency for groups to be controlled by their most committed members has been known at least since the 14th century, when it was articulated by Ibn Khaldun, the Muslim philosopher and historian credited by some scholars with being the father of sociology. Khaldun presented that specific theory to the Mongol conqueror Timur, also known as Tamerlane, just days before Timur sacked Damascus and murdered most of its citizens. When the history MacDonald is trying to explain forces him to acknowledge ugly anti-Semitism, he explains it as a defensive reaction to Jewish clannishness. When the Jews do something, it's innate and biological. When Gentiles do the same, or even much worse, it's a legitimate, non-biological, reactive defense against the clannish, dishonest Jews. Let's take another brief look at how extensive scholarship, coupled with anti-Semitic tropes, has played to anti-Semites. Consider David Duke.
A man that I feel incredible personal debt to. And that's, of course, Dr. Kevin MacDonald. It seems like great men come about in times of crisis at just the right time. All of us knew the basic theme of what Dr. Kevin MacDonald was writing about when he finally put it into words. But he finally put it into words, this Jewish evolutionary strategy. And his intensive research made it possible for us to expose this strategy. There could be no more question, no real effective argument against our position about Jewish hatred, misanthropy. He quotes their hypocrisy. He quotes them saying that they're superior people, while at the same time quotes them showing how they're trying to destroy all other peoples. And at the same time accusing us of being supremacists. They are the ultimate supremacists on the earth. And their supremacy, it's like any sort of racist, European racism magnified by 100 times, 1,000 times. We have enough material in his books to convince the world. This understanding is very clear that we have to really define and understand the enemy. And many of us labor, I'm sad to say, many of us still want to be polite today in a sense. Many of us labor under the delusion, that somehow we're going to change this enemy. Somehow we're going to convince them not to be the genocidal maniacs that they are. They're not to become nice, made-over Aryans with a little education. We all know that's not true. And he shows why that's not true. He shows the historical record right again and again and again and again. You don't need the protocols. You've got more power than the protocols, on every page of his masterpieces.
These are the masterpieces that have superseded the protocols of Zion. In understanding MacDonald's influence, we have to consider how he appeals to social scientists who are not anti-Semitic. First of all, his claims to be a legitimate evolutionary scientist were supported by his tenured professorship in the University of California system. And note that these masterpieces were published by a legitimate academic publisher. I could find no indication that Prager Publishing, which was founded and run by a Jew, was anti-Semitic. Once MacDonald's shoddy scholarship was brought to light, his books were withdrawn from Prager's list and are now self-published. From 1995 to 2001, during the time these books were published, MacDonald was on the executive board of the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, which is the premier scientific society focused on understanding evolution and human behavior. At the 2000 annual meeting of the society, I presented a devastating critique of MacDonald's pseudoscience. Note that MacDonald accepted my invitation and he was on the panel. Though MacDonald could offer no coherent defense of his racist nonsense, the response by some legitimate evolutionists in the audience was that, in dismissing his work as pseudoscience, we were flirting with dangerous censorship. However, these defenders of free speech also acknowledged that they had never read any of MacDonald's work. MacDonald was subsequently denounced by the Society's president and was never again elected to the board. Yet as recently as 2022, the respectable Springer journal Philosophia, which was originally subtitled The Philosophical Quarterly of Israel, published an article by Kevin MacDonald in which he made his typical absurd comparative claims without comparative evidence. After considerable controversy arose over this article, I was asked to review it, and I documented the scientific absurdity of MacDonald's claims, as well as the dubious scholarship of the references within his article. For example, 9 of MacDonald's scholarly references in that article were to articles published in the white nationalist, anti-Semitic, pseudoscientific journals, the Occidental Quarterly or the Occidental Observer. Note that MacDonald founded the Observer and is the editor of the Quarterly. Shortly thereafter, the article was withdrawn and the editor who had accepted it resigned. The point is that folks without training in modern evolutionary biology are easily bamboozled by claims dressed in Darwinian garb. You don't have to be an anti-Semite to believe that MacDonald presents a legitimate evolutionary understanding. But the anti-Semites are absolutely enamored with MacDonald. Consider.
And then Paul Krugman, describing Trump voters, he said they were voting for blood and soil, patriarchy, and racial hierarchy. Would that I were so, right? I mean,
in addition to his misrepresentation that modern evolutionary theory supports his conclusions, there is a kernel of truth in some of his nonsense, a kernel of truth that he can then use to convince people that his ideas are sound. For example, many liberal academics and activists insist that all claims about biological group differences are racist and that culture can account for all of them. But anyone without a thoroughgoing woke religious ideology knows that is nonsense. It's an obvious fact that groups that have been breeding separately in different ecological contexts tend to evolve genetic differences. In addition to the physical differences by which we recognize people whose ancestors evolved in different regions, there are undeniable behavioral and psychological differences that cannot be just culturally induced, culturally influenced, yes, but not just cultural. For example, the percentage of passionate interest in American football among whites and blacks is similar, the blue part of the chart. This means that even though football is somewhat more popular among blacks, given the racial makeup of the United States, 15% black, 75% white, there are almost 5 times as many passionate white football fans, yet more than half of all NFL players are black. Consider distance running. Of the athletes holding the best marathon times in history, 93% were born in East Africa. Kenya, with half of 1% of the world's population, holds more than 1/3 of the distance race records. And of course, certain differences between Jews and Gentiles are much too statistically anomalous to be just cultural. In addition to MacDonald's comparisons without comparative data, there are actual differences that have abundant comparative data. For example, of the 965 Nobel Prize winners between 1901 and 2023, 216 have been Jews or have had at least one Jewish parent, representing 22% of the total. Yet Jews comprise less than 1/5 of 1% of the world's population. The Jewish share of Nobel Prize winners is thus 110 times their proportion of the world's population. Here's another group that's selected solely on the basis of their behavior. Yet a chi-square calculation indicates that almost half of this group, being Jewish, would be less than a 1 in a million chance phenomena. So there are differences between groups, but in MacDonald's nonsensical theory of a Jewish evolutionary strategy, like animal breeders, Jews systematically bred themselves to be smarter, more diligent, and more tenaciously focused on achievement, so that they could outcompete and dominate Gentiles. A better theory explaining the undeniable differences between Jews and Gentiles is that over 2,000 years, anti-Semitic Gentiles have systematically bred the Jews among them to have these traits. After the Romans decimated and expelled the Jews from Judea, the surviving Jewish groups were subjected to 20 centuries of discrimination and repeated bottleneck selection. Selective breeding has produced dramatic changes in domestic animals in far shorter time frames. Furthermore, Jews have repeatedly experienced bottleneck selection in which entire groups have been forcefully expelled from their homes and or subjected to large-scale murderous violence. In a specific instance, some of the survivors have just been lucky. But when you repeat this process numerous times, inevitably you will breed a group that is more capable of surviving under harsh conditions. Kevin MacDonald was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin, where he fell into the campus counterculture and became a radical in the anti-war movement during the war in Vietnam. I got involved in the movement really because I had these Jewish roommates. I just tried to fit in, he says. In a footnote to one of his books, MacDonald recounts, I was recruited to give a talk in which I was to explain how an ex-Catholic from a small town in Wisconsin had come to be converted to the cause. 30 years after feeling like a token non-Jew in a purportedly Jewish political movement, MacDonald cited his experience as proof that Jews in general are compelled to challenge traditional American ideals by taking over political and cultural movements fronted by token non-Jews. As an academic, MacDonald may have felt like an outsider who wasn't fully accepted into a Jewish group. That's understandable. Contrary to MacDonald's simplistic claims, assimilation is not always immediate or easy. He apparently felt that his lack of full acceptance meant that he and his intellectual talents weren't being given the admiration they deserved. In this, he was not the first person to avoid the narcissistic injury of having his ideas rejected by concluding that there was a conspiracy against him, rather than becoming aware of the substandard nature of his thinking. Pseudoscience just isn't science. In defending himself against such claims, MacDonald wrote that the deeper point is that whatever my motivations and biases, I would like to suppose that my work on Judaism at least meets the criteria of good social science, even if I have come to the point of seeing my subjects in a less than flattering light. In the end, does it really matter if my motivation at this point is less than pristine? Based on the quality of his academic pseudoscientific work, apparently it does matter. The fuller implications of the modern evolutionary view of human history, with a specific focus on explaining the Holocaust, can be found in The Book of War, the evolutionary biology of racism, religious hatred, nationalism, terrorism, and genocide.